Hi students, it's Mr. Ramage, and we're going to take a look at imperialism in India. Now this isn't going to be a super deep dive into lots of details. We're basically going to do a very brief overview looking at how the British were able to take control of the subcontinent of India and add it to their ever-growing empire. So in terms of India, trade had been going on between India and Europe for quite a while. But the problem was it took a long time to get to India, and it took a long time to bring those resources back to Europe. And because of that, there's just not very many of them, and it's very, very expensive. So during the 1400s and this age of exploration, Europeans were in search of a route by sea to get to India so that they could acquire those goods and return to Europe faster with more goods and sell them for a greater profit. Eventually, in 1497, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama does reach India, and we now have a sea route between Europe and India. So lots of European countries are heading to India, but it is England that really establishes control over trade. Remember, our old imperialism was mostly focused on trade, and that's how the British are going to begin to take control of India, and it's not going to happen overnight. On December 31st, 1600, the British East India Company is going to get exclusive trading rights in India by receiving a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I. So basically what this means is that the East India Company has exclusive rights to do business in India. Every other business is not technically allowed to trade or manage trade in the area. It all falls under the control of the East India Company, and they are going to become extraordinarily rich and extraordinarily powerful because of this royal charter. In 1608, the company begins establishing trading posts along the coast of India, and gradually over time is going to assume control of larger areas of land. Now, the East India Company is not there to necessarily conquer land, but rather to trade with local leaders and local farmers and local business. But eventually, the East India Company actually will become sort of like a pseudo-government, especially after, in 1757, the Battle of Plassey, where the East India Company, which has its own army, defeats an Indian army and then takes control of these two very significant areas of India, Bengal and Bihar, which hopefully I'm pronouncing correctly. So what's happening is the British East India Company is becoming sort of a pseudo-government. They're expanding throughout India by conquering different parts of India. Now, India is not a united country in the 16 and 1700s. It's made up of different provinces or kingdoms which have local leaders, most of them like princes, if you will. So what they're doing is they're going into different areas of India and they're negotiating these treaties and deals with these princes to gain access to their resources in exchange for wealth, in exchange for defeating other people around the area that are rivals to this person for a number of reasons, right? So the East Indian Company is able to get into India and take control of it. By 1765, the company is actually collecting taxes in the provinces that they are administering in Bengal and Bihar. So in a way, they are sort of becoming a government. But remember, this is starting out as a company. This would be like Walmart going to India and beginning to take over, and Walmart having an army and Walmart taxing the people of India. So it is kind of crazy, right? So they're acting like a pseudo-government. And the company continues to grow and grow and grow. And with the more money it has, the more resources it can buy, the more men they can hire to be their sort of personal army, the more guns they can buy. And then they go out and they conquer and defeat more areas of India to gain more control of land and put more land under their control. And they just kind of grow and grow and grow over the period of about 200 years or so. So as you look at the map from left to right, the yellow areas are areas under British control. And then as we go further towards the middle of the screen, we can see that yellow area getting larger, while the red area not under British control is getting smaller and smaller. And then finally, to the right side of the screen, we see a significant amount of India under British rule and British control. Again, this is all under the control of a company called the East India Company. Kind of crazy. Now, in order to control all that land, the East India Company had to hire lots of soldiers for their own little private army. Well, there weren't enough British men who were willing to sail off and live in India and fight for the East India Company. So, in order to help maintain their control of these many provinces and areas, the East India Company hired Indian soldiers to serve and work for the East India Company, and their name is going to be called the Sepoys. That's what they're going to be called. These native Indian men serving for the East India Company. You can see they're dressed up in somewhat British attire with the red uniforms, kind of Indianized a little bit with the turbans and some other adornments, right? And by 1806, there are 130,000 Sepoy serving with the British men in this East India Company army, right? And then again, this is not the government's army. This is the East India Company's army. But that's a huge number, right? That is a lot of Indian men, a lot of Sepoy fighting for the East India Company. Now, we need to talk a little bit about religion in India. So in India, there are two major religions. The largest of them is people who are Hindu, okay? The minority religion in India are people who practice Islam, people who are Muslim. And the reason why we need to know this is because something's about to happen that is going to sort of trigger the Sepoy who are serving in this East India Army. So if you are someone who is Hindu, your religious beliefs do not want you to have anything to do with any type of beef product. So cows are somewhat, you could consider them sacred in the Hindu faith. And so you don't eat meat from a cow, you don't drink milk from a cow, you don't wear any clothing made of leather from a cow. Cows are essentially sacred and you're not going to do anything with them. If you are a Muslim, then you are going to abstain or not eat any pork products. So you're not going to eat any meat or have anything to do or touch any kind of anything that would come from a pig. All right, it's a very simple way of looking at it. We're not getting into the details of why they don't do these things. We just need to know that they don't, right? So Hindus don't have anything to do with beef, and Muslims don't have anything to do with pork. Well, the reason we need to know that is that something kind of interesting is going to happen in 1857. So again, these men are fighting for essentially the British, and within the British Army, which again, this is not the official army, the British were using Enfield rifles. And the Enfield rifle was the most modern weapon. And in order to fire your Enfield rifle, you used a capsule, which you can see on the screen here. And in that capsule, sort of the precursor to the modern bullet, you had your musket ball in there, and you had your gunpowder, and you had your paper, and your flint, and everything else that you needed in order to fire that round or that bullet. And this was a huge improvement upon loading it individually. Basically, you put everything in one little wrapper, and then you bit the top off of it, and you poured it into your muzzle of your rifle, and then you rammed it down, and then you could fire. This would help speed up your ability to fire more bullets per minute. Well, in order to make sure that the gunpowder was dry, because if the gunpowder gets wet, then the bullet won't fire, they would coat it in animal fat. And maybe you can see where we're going here. The rumor spreads very quickly amongst the Sepoy, again, those are the Indian soldiers, that these cartridges are coated in animal fat, and that fat comes from pigs and from cows. So right there, you have a big problem. If you are a Hindu soldier, you're not going to touch this because it contains or is coated in the fat from a cow. If you're a Muslim soldier, you're not going to touch it because it might contain fat from a pig. So right there, they're violating your religious beliefs and forcing you to do something that violates what you believe in. So the Sepoy, when they are given these cartridges and rifles, refuse to take them. And a group of 85 Sepoy are going to be arrested and are going to be thrown into jail. And they're waiting trial, and they might be executed by the East India Company for refusing to follow orders. Very serious crime if you are in the army, right? So the Sepoy are locked up, and then word spreads about that to some of the surrounding areas and surrounding towns. and a mutiny begins. And a mutiny is when soldiers fight back against their commanding officers and sort of reject their orders. So an angry mob goes into the barracks where these men are being held, and they release them, and then they mutiny. They begin to shoot and kill the British soldiers who are there, and then they go off and they kill some British men and women and children in the city of Kapaw, and then this big mutiny actually spreads across the country, all over these cartridges coated in animal fat. And this is an event that's called the Sepoy Mutiny, and it's going to last for about 5 months as groups of Sepoy go through and across the country, attacking British men and women and children, British towns, trading posts, attacking the East India Company businesses and offices and things like that. And this is like really bad. This goes on for a period of about 5 months until finally the British Army shows up and puts down the Sepoy Mutiny. And they do it pretty graphically, pretty gruesomely, as we'll see here in a few minutes. But this event is a huge turning point in the relationship between England and India. On the map here, you can see a number of revolts taking place throughout the country, the areas where they took place. Feel free to pause and check that out in more detail. And during our unit of study, we are looking a lot at political cartoons. So let's look at 2 from this event of the Sepoy Mutiny. We see an image here of a woman dressed kind of like an ancient Greek or Roman, and this is Justice. Justice is typically something that you would see maybe in a courthouse, right? So Justice is typically blind. She's blindfolded. She's holding a sword. She's holding scales. And Justice is there to kind of remind us that the court should be blind and we should keep the scales balanced and everything should be fair and equal. And yeah, that's a cool thing, right? But Justice in this political cartoon is definitely not blind. She has her blindfold removed. She can see very clearly. She is looking directly at the Indian soldiers down at her feet. You can see she has her right foot on the chest of a soldier who appears to maybe be dead or dying. She is wielding in her right hand a sword. She's in her left hand a shield with the scales on it. And it looks like she's about to take her sword and hack at the guy down in the yellow hat who is holding up his hand to sort of shield him, maybe from the blow of Justice. In the background, we can see British soldiers also attacking the Sepoy, the Indian men. We can see those soldiers doing the attacking. We can see women and children here sort of to the right and behind Justice, cradling and carrying their children, looking kind of sad and scared, maybe wailing or crying. We see dead bodies in the foreground. And in the background, we can see cannons and we can see smoke and clouds above maybe a city or a settlement in the background. And the caption of the cartoon is Justice. And the question is this justice, right? So Justice is supposed to be blind. Justice is supposed to be neutral. But in this instance, we see Justice has taken off her blindfold and is out to kill the Indian men who rebelled and mutinied against the British. And in this cartoon, which is captioned The British Lion and the Bengal Tiger, we see some similar imagery here. We are going to see, number one, the women and the children lying here in the grass. Looks like they may be stripped from the waist up. I don't know if they're alive or not. They don't really look alive. And they represent the women and children killed by the Sepoy at the city of Kapur in India during the Sepoy Mutiny. And here we see the British lion and the Indian Bengal tiger, 2 national symbols, right? So symbolism is very big in political cartoons. In this case, India or the Sepoy is being represented by the Bengal tiger, and the British are being represented by the lion. You'll see lots of animal symbolism in our political cartoons. And we can see that the lion is baring his teeth and is attacking the tiger, who appears to be pounced over top of that woman and child, maybe getting ready to eat them or something, right? So we see the British lion racing in to save or avenge, possibly, the women and children. Once the uprising was put down, the Sepoys were arrested and gathered up, and many of them were executed. Many of them were hung. It was done publicly to send a message to everybody else. But more gruesomely, many sepoy were executed by cannon, where you would strap them to the front of a cannon, literally with their back against the barrel of the cannon, and then a shot would be fired through your body, which would basically split your body into all sorts of different pieces. Pretty terrible way to go. So the British were very violent in their retribution. They put down the sepoy savagely. Things were really nasty between the British and the Indians, especially during and after the Sepoy Mutiny. Well, once the mutiny is over, it is going to change what is going to happen in India. So what we're going to see is that this East India Company has kind of failed to maintain the peace, if you will. They've had it was under their watch that the mutiny took place. So what the British decide to do is say, hey, we can't really let India and all these resources fall into control of this company, right? We need to take control. So after the Sepoy Mutiny, we're going to see India transformed into a colony of the British Empire, as the British government is going to take direct control of all of India. So now all of India will fall under the rule of the British, becoming a colony and a part of the British Empire. Queen Victoria will be named the Empress of India, so another title for her. And now as a royal colony, India will come under more firm control. So under the control of the East India Company, it was kind of just about business. Now that it's a royal colony, the British are going to control pretty much every aspect of society and business and culture and pretty much everything in India. And then over the years, India will come to be known as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. India is going to produce a vast amount of wealth for England, especially in cotton, but also in many other things. India is a very large area with a lot of people, so they are going to produce vast wealth for the British. And this period of time where the British are in control of India is called the British Raj. Okay, R-A-J, Raj. So what's going to happen in India under the control of the British? Well, some good things are actually going to happen. And I'm not saying that imperialism is good for the native people, but the British are going to bring the country under a greater sense of control and bring stability to it. So the British need to see, they want to produce as many goods as they can and get as many resources as they can. So in order to do that, they need to bring a certain amount of stability to the area. So under the British rule, India, which was a very divided and divisive country, is going to come together under one government. So all of these different provinces and princes and kingdoms that were happening in India, all those are basically going to go away, and the British will institute a stable national government in India. Obviously controlled by them, right? So the Indian people are not going to be in control of their own government. Let's definitely remember that. So the British will rule in India. They're going to create a national education system. Well, that sounds awesome, except for the fact that it's only going to teach people in India how to speak English, and it's only going to really train the upper class Indians. So in India, not that we have a ton of time to get into it, had what was called a caste system. So a very divided social system with a few people at the top who typically, owned land and had wealth and money. Well, those are the people that are going to be trained and taught to sort of adopt the English way of life. Most people who are Indian are going to not get very good jobs, except for those upper class people. Most people in India are not going to be going to these schools, but are going to remain uneducated and illiterate. So yes, the British are going to set up a school system, but it's only going to really benefit the top part of society. The majority of Indian people are not really going to benefit from it at all, although they're all going to be expected to learn and speak English. British are going to build roads and railroads and universities and hospitals and sewer systems. India was very much underdeveloped, and these things are going to definitely be positives, right? So it's going to help the overall public in India in many ways. The roads are going to unite the country together and allow for better travel and business. Same thing with the railroads. More hospitals and more schools are definitely a good thing. Sewer systems, again, awesome thing. But it's all coming at a cost to the Indian people. So it looks good, it looks like the British are fixing up the country, but in reality, the British are doing this for their own benefit. Indian business, speaking of, how are we really helping these people? Well, we're really not. Indian business is going to suffer significantly because British goods are going to be flooded into India, and the British are basically going to shut down Indian businesses that are producing goods that will be competing with them. So prior to the British taking over India, 27% of world trade came out of India, which is more than a quarter of the world's business back in the 1800s, which is a lot, right? In any year, that's a lot. But after the British took control, Indian business, goods that were made in India, only made up 2% of world trade. So India went from really dominating world trade at like 27%, which is incredible, down to only 2%, which is really, really, really low. The British shut down all these Indian businesses that were producing goods for sale because the British don't want the Indians to make goods. The British want the Indians to buy their goods. Cotton. One of the biggest resources that the British wanted from India was their cotton to take back to their textile factories and to make into textiles. Cotton was planted instead of food, so the British increased Indian cotton production at the cost of planting and growing food. So fields that grew food were plowed under and cotton was planted instead because cotton was more valuable. Over 30 million Indian people are going to starve between 1800 and 1900. There are going to be famines all the time because more people are growing cotton and less people are growing food, and that's a big problem. So there is going to be massive, massive, massive death in India during the Raj in terms of starvation. The population is going to drop, and that's also from diseases which occur when people are starving or malnourished or undernourished. Britons were given the best jobs and opportunity, right? So there's a lot of racism going on. The people in India are not European. They are not British. They are Indian. They are, again, inferior to the British, and they're going to be treated as such. So the best jobs went to the Britons. The best opportunities went to white Britons living in India. And the Indian people are going to be treated pretty poorly, right? Even Indians who were in that upper class, who had learned how to speak English and were very proper and wealthy, were treated poorly because of the fact that they were Indian. They were not as good as white British people. So a lot of things going on here in India, right? We could talk about it for a very long time, but that's kind of the basic look at what's happening in India. And this Raj, this British control of India, is going to last from 1858 till 1947. So just under 100 years of British rule in India, and that's going to come to an end in 1947, and the guy who is mostly responsible for that is Mohandas Gandhi, and you've probably maybe heard of him before. Hopefully you have. We're not going to talk about Gandhi right now, but he's the guy that kind of helps lead this big civil rights movement in India. And then afterwards, the British, on their way out of India, are actually going to mess up the country pretty significantly through what's called the Partition of India. Because after the British leave, well, actually right before the British leave, they draw some new borders for the country to divide India into now India and Pakistan, Western Pakistan and then Eastern Pakistan, over here by Bangladesh. This is going to be a huge, huge, huge problem because when they divided the country, they didn't really pay attention to the different ethnic and religious groups in the country and created a super huge, terrible mess. Pakistan was going to be created for, Pakistan and East Pakistan were going to be created for the Muslim population of India, while India itself was going to remain predominantly Hindu. But the problem was there were people living in this place that is now being called Pakistan who are Hindu, and there are people in India who are Muslim. So when it's all said and done, about 15 million people were forced to move and relocate to different places. And there was a lot of bad blood between Indians who were Hindu and Indians who were Muslim. And as this partition takes place, a lot of people took opportunity for this partition and movement to go out and kill a lot of people, which sadly took place all over parts of India. And at the end of it, about 2 million Indian people are going to die during this partition. So even on the way out, the British really messed things up for the Indian people. Again, we're not doing a deep dive, we're just doing a basic summary. So yeah, the partition was not a good idea. It was not handled very well, and it resulted in chaos and a lot of dead people. So here are some key takeaways, hopefully, from this video lesson. Number one, the British East India Company established British control in India. So it begins under a sort of system of economic imperialism and will eventually become a colony. And that takes place after the Sepoy Mutiny, which happened when Sepoy or Indian soldiers revolted against the East India Company for being forced to use the Enfield rifle with the cartridges that were coated in animal fat. After the Sepoy Mutiny, the British government is going to take control of India, making it a royal colony, and while the British rule, it will be called the British Raj, as the British rule for almost 100 years in India, taking direct control over their government and culture and pretty much everything in society. Colonialism in India is going to bring some benefits to the Indian infrastructure, but remember, these benefits aren't primarily necessarily for the Indian people, but rather for the British, so that they can run the country better and more efficient so that they can profit. And really, colonial rule benefited the British and only a very small portion of Indian society. So that is a overview of imperialism in India. Again, we're not going to do any specific deep dives. We're looking at big picture things. So hopefully you've got all that down, and hopefully you've learned something.